What's up guys, Arctic's Gaming back here with a Diablo 4 video. Going to go over the Necromancer, the uniques, and how I feel about the class so far. First up though, as far as my build goes, obviously you can't really tell by me quickly scrolling through it, but I'll have a link in the description to a website that has my build on it, including all the sacrifices with the dead stuff and all the gear that you see here. Really only going to talk about this one right here, because that's the only unique for the Necromancer that I have so far. It's only level 72, really haven't done that many Nightmare Dungeons yet. But I want to discuss about this unique in particular. Because as you'll see in my build, all of the uniques for the Necromancer, and I'll show you them later on a website, don't really do anything that's necessarily pertains to my class and what I do with it. So right here, everybody knows Bone Spear is pretty much the end-all be-all for end-game Necromancer builds, currently anyway. And since I'm going with a Blood Necromancer, I can get insane overpowered damage from Blood Surge and guaranteed overpowers from Wrathman's Vigor, but everybody knows Bone Spear is where it's at. The killing problem is Essence Management. But I want you to compare, and take note this is only a 727 item power helmet. So obviously, if you're level 100, it's going to be more than just 913 damage, bigger range as well. But when you have Bone Spear that deals, 2.5, 3.5 on critical strikes anyway, damage at in-game level 100, when you have a bonus of, let's say for shits and giggles, at a level 100 helmet, Deathless Visage would give you 10,000 damage on that Echo, right? 10,000 damage. And I believe the max it can leave behind is 3, so that's 30,000 damage. And it's also spaced pretty much on what the game considers as distant range. That's the range in between each explosion. Yeah, that's a total of 30,000 damage. That's not even guaranteed to hit all 3 explosions on the same enemy. On a skill that can already do upwards of 3 million damage in the first place. And that's just, I believe that's just on the first hit. Not including any of the Bone Spears that actually break off or come back and hit them. So yeah, as far as uniques go for the Necromancer, I don't think that there's any very useful ones, at least not for my build, unfortunately. Although there is one, and unfortunately that specific unique that I'm talking about is not even a Necromancer unique, Necromancer specific unique. Rather it is a unique that every class can access, or sorry, not every class, just the Barbarian and the Necromancer. Those are the only 2 classes that can use it because it's a 2-handed sword. The Grandfather. Right, so it increases your critical strike damage by 60 to 80%, and the other properties of this weapon can roll higher than normal, which include damage, maximum life, all stats, and ignores durability loss, which is not necessarily useful for solo players or co-op players. I mean, solo, I guess it's okay if you're running really high tier Nightmare Dungeons and dying all the time. That can prevent a little bit of gold loss on your side. But if you're playing co-op, it's pretty much useless unless you're off by yourself doing something, which in most cases I'm not. I am. Whoever I'm playing with, I'm usually around and we're doing the same Nightmare Dungeon or the same events or the same Helltide, whatever it is. Right, so if you look at the other uniques that are specific to the Necromancer, the only ones that I consider even worth equipping really, when it comes to Blood Necromancers, is Deathless Visage, which I had on, and Blood Artisan's Cuirass. Um, yeah, the helmet Bone Spear leaves behind echoes as it travels that explode. That's pretty much negligent. It's so insignificant amount of a damage, and it also relies on the enemy being in the right spot at the right time. Because those explosions they don't have a very large area of effect. and they are spread out roughly what the game considers um, a distant range. So if you have a distant enemy, I believe the low end of that range is roughly the distance in between the Bone Spear echoes. And when each echo deals 1,000 damage at level 72 on my helmet currently, you get a total of 3,000 extra damage on top of the maybe minimum 50k that you might be dealing. So I mean, yeah, we're looking at a 6% bonus on a unique item in damage. It's like that's really not useful at all, really. But the Blood Artisan's Curious, when you pick up 10 to 5 Blood Orbs, a free Bone Spirit is spawned, dealing bonus damage based on your current life percent. Now, when you look at Bone Spirit, it is a skill that uses all the essence that you currently have, whether that's 0 or maximum 120, whatever. Um, so getting Bone Spirit, a free Bone Spirit, that's, you know, whenever it procs anyway, you can take that as however much essence that you had when it procs, you got that essence for free, technically. Not necessarily, because obviously the ratio to like essence usage to damage is not necessarily the same for all skills, especially in the same class. But getting a free Bone Spirit's not bad. But when you compare all the other ones, at least for Blood Necromancer, all of the other uniques are pretty much useless. Corpse Explosion don't use, Darkness don't use, although technically I do have Bone Storm as a Darkness skill, but, you know, putting a two-handed weapon, and it's on a skill that has a 50-second cooldown, it's not the best. Right? So create desecrated ground beneath your Sever Specters, don't use it. Corpse Explosion, don't use it. Minions, don't use them. Minions, don't use them. Right? So when you're looking at uniques for the Necromancer, you have two, at least for the Blood Necromancer, again, you have two slightly useful uniques that are specific to the Necromancer. And then you have the Grandfather, which I consider a top tier weapon for the Necromancer that you should probably focus on getting, just because obviously with Necromancer, if you're going for overpower damage, your overpower damage is going to be insane as it is. So getting a 50% increase to 550, that's not going to do anything. But getting a 50%, or sorry, 60%, that's the lowest roll, 60% added on to my 80 on critical strike damage is not that bad. So yeah, I think it's kind of telling that the only good uniques for the Necromancer really, and again, Blood Necromancer, are ones that other classes can get anyway, because the two that I mentioned aren't even that useful. The chest is okay, and the helmet's really, I just like the helmet because of the guaranteed rolls of physical damage, critical strike damage with bone skills, maximum essence, and the total armor. That's real good, but the aspect on it is you could replace that with anything else and I wouldn't notice. I would literally just be looking at those 4 rolls right there and whether or not they're better than the one I have. So when it comes to diversity, at least for the Necromancer, obviously most builds are going to be focusing on Bone Spear. And you might see a couple of Blood Surge overpower builds. They're okay, but it's very conditional damage-wise. Whereas Bone Spear, you can get consistent damage output that's pretty crazy at level 100. Whereas if level 100 waiting 12 seconds or a 3% chance for a skill to overpower is not very conducive to clearing dungeons quickly, because if you're sitting there with a Bone Spear and you can deal great damage constantly, then it's not a problem. But if you can only deal good damage conditionally, then you're going to be way behind on clearing, and it's just going to slow the game down entirely. And I think it kind of shows the difference in between the subclasses of certain classes. For instance, the Rogue, I think with the Rogue you can't really go wrong with any build that you make unless you're intentionally making it a bad build, because all of the Rogue skills, they all kind of have their own place. They're all good in certain situations. But the Necromancer, I feel like you kind of just get funneled into using Bone Spear and going with Bone Spear build. just because if you go blood, it's just conditional, and it's not consistent, and that's not going to help you clear high tier nightmare dungeons fast. You need to be consistent. You can't just have damage drop offs where you're dealing in crazy damage against a group of trash mobs and then weak damage against the boss, right? Because that's going to take you forever. But if say you have Bone Spear, then you're good against bosses, especially bosses because they have very large hitboxes. You're going to be good against mobs because it can just penetrate, and you're going to be good against single elites that are just by themselves because Bone Spear does great damage anyway. So yeah, I really feel like the total skill balance when it comes to Necromancers could have been done a little bit better. You know, and obviously I could just switch my build around to go with Bone Spear, but I don't feel that I should have to do a specific build to get far in the game. You know, doing a few specific builds for each class to reach in-game stuff and say beat Uber Lilith solo fast. That's a different story, but I don't feel like I should be funneled into a certain build just to get to the end game. You know what I'm saying? Like I feel like there could have been a little bit more balance inside of the Necromancer class, or you know, switching around the aspects, like making the Bone Spear leaps behind echoes, make that one that you can extract, and make the Bone Spear vulnerability one that comes on a unique that you cannot extract. That's how I think it should be. Because then, you know, you'd actually have a reason to go after this unique instead of just seeing Bone Spear leaps behind echoes that increase your base damage by maybe 5-6%. Like, it's not really even worth having the aspect on here. Like I said, the only reason that I go for this helmet is because those 4 guaranteed rolls right there are pretty much perfect, you know? So yeah, I really feel like Blood Necromancers are kind of in this state where it's not a bad build, it's just very inconsistent, and you only deal damage every once in a while. As opposed to classes like Sorceress late game where you can get Frost Uniques that pretty much take your build and go one step further with it, even though Sorceress class itself is very squishy right now. I do think there's a good trade-off when it comes to you being able to straight up delete enemies, but at the same time, if you get into a boss fight and you're not watching out, then you can get one shot. I think that's fine, especially because Sorceress has quite a bit of defensive skills, although it does really suck that you only have 6 skill slots total. So when you have a Sorceress that's using 3 to 4 defensive skills, then the majority of your skills are defensive, right? So this, you know, it wouldn't be a problem if we had 10 slots, but that's a whole different conversation, really. So yeah, that's about wraps up my feelings on the way that Necromancer, especially Blood Necro, is going so far. Um, and like I said, it's not bad. It's just at a point where it's kind of annoying to see when you're playing in co-op, see your friends go through dungeons, regardless of what class you're playing, and they just rip through shit. And then as a Blood Necro, you're like occasionally killing everything and then dealing no damage, occasionally dealing everything, dealing no damage. So I really think that I'd like to see more of a consistent damage output from Blood Necro without having to switch the build up entirely and go Bone Spear. So that's why I'll be using a rogue probably to go to level 100, even though this Necromancer is almost 73, and I also have a druid at level 50. I think the rogue is the most balanced inside of itself class. It's pretty powerful compared to other classes, but I think in terms of looking in depth into the class and the subclasses, it has the best ratio of balance. Because right now, if you're a Necromancer, you're pretty much running Bone Spear, and if you're not, well, you're running something else until you get the gear that you can be crazy good with Bone Spear. So yeah, I think I'd like to see that changed in the future, and obviously this is Season 0, you know, we haven't even heard of any buffs or nerfs that Season 1 might bring about. So who knows? Blood Necromancer in Season 1 might actually be really good. Um, I don't necessarily know if they're going to nerf Bone Spear, but I could see it. Um, but yeah, I think it would be more reasonable to buff the other subclasses in Necromancer rather than nerfing Bone Spear, because then that just leaves us at kind of this weird thing where all the builds are equal, but none of them are super good. So there wouldn't be a huge point in playing Necromancer at that point. Um, so yeah, that about wraps up my feelings. Hopefully I'll have some more Diablo 4 content for you guys. But yeah, that's about it. See ya.